Hello and welcome. My name is Rosani Rios. I am the Strategic Populations Manager for the Office of Workforce Development. Today, we are going to be facilitating Module 1, Youth Program Foundation and Eligibility. This is the first training module of the Title I Youth Program Training Series that will be provided by the Office of Workforce Development. Let's dive in. WIOA Title I background. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, was signed into law on July 2014, and it was enacted on July 2015, meaning that it has been in effect for almost 8 years. The law was designed to help job seekers access employment, education, training, and supportive services in order for job seekers to succeed in the labor market. On the other hand, WIOA is also designed to match employers with the skilled workers they need through the provision of a number of business services. What is the ultimate goal for WIOA? The ultimate goal for WIOA is to provide services that can assist individuals with barriers to employment to obtain jobs, good jobs with sustainable wages, and for employers to have skilled workers that meet their business needs. What you do as part of your day-to-day work makes this goal a reality for the job seekers and businesses in Georgia. So what you do is important. It's through you that we get this goal accomplished. Now, let's talk about WIOA Title I and its programs. WIOA Title I has 3 main programs: Adult Dislocated Worker Program and the Youth Program. The Youth Program has 2 categories within that program: the in-school youth and adult school youth. It is important to mention that each of these programs have its own eligibility requirement, funding source, and each program targets a specific population. For this training today, we're going to be focusing on the youth program. WIOA Title I Youth Program has a broader youth vision than WIA. The WIOA Youth Program integrates service delivery systems and leverage community resources. Why? Because USDOL understands that this program is created to assist youth that have a multitude number of barriers, and our system alone does not have all the resources to support these youth in a holistic manner. Therefore, we need our partners to help us accomplish the goal. We cannot do this work alone. We need the help of our partners in order to serve our youth. WIOA brought significant changes through the youth program. One of those changes was a greater focus on out-of-school youth. This is evidenced by an increased eligibility age to 24. This is also evidenced by the fact that most out-of-school youth don't have to be low income. Also, by the fact that the law added a new barrier for an out-of-school youth, which is the barrier of compulsory school age but not attending. Another important change from WIA to WIOA is the expansion on youth services. Under WIA, we had 10 youth program elements. Under WIOA, we have 14 youth program elements. And some of those new program elements include financial literacy, labor market information, and other activities to help youth be prepared for the labor market. Another important change that I want to highlight here today is the greater flexibility for the use of self-attestation that WIOA has brought to the youth program. According to our most recent youth guidance, TIGL 0922, self-attestation is an acceptable documentation for almost all program elements related to WIOA youth eligibility. The only youth element that is not permitted to be validated through self-attestation is basic skill sufficiency. This helps us simplify the eligibility process because whenever we need to use self-attestation, we are now allowed to use self-attestation. The last important change that I want to highlight today is the increased flexibility for partnership, co-enrollment, and braiding of funds. As I explained earlier, we serve youth with a multitude of barriers and needs. And USDOL understood this, and they have created changes within WIOA that allow us to better partner, break funds when that's appropriate, and co-enroll participants, which is great because that way we can better accomplish our goal. And it's important to keep in mind that we can co-enroll, that we can break funds, and that this is the only way that we're going to be able to be successful in completing our goal here. We have talked about the overall changes that WIA brought to WIOA. Let's dive into the purpose of the youth program under WIA. What do we do? I already explained that we serve youth with one or more barriers to employment. Why do we help these youth? Well, we help them because these barriers prevent them from access, training and access, education and access, good employment opportunity with sustainable wages. Without our services, these youth won't be able to get where they need to go. Therefore, what you do is very important. How do we do this? With the provision of the 14 program elements in partnership with our community organization. As I mentioned before, the youth program has two big categories: in-school youth and out-of-school youth. And it is important to understand these two categories because each category has its own eligibility requirements. So before we move to discuss all of the eligibility requirements per category, I think that it's time for a poll question. Yes, it is. It's a true or false statement. School status is established after the case manager has determined the youth is eligible for Title I services. Is that true or false? Let's see. Well, the correct answer is false. Why? A case manager cannot initiate the eligibility determination process, cannot start the enrollment process without first establishing the school status, because the school status is going to determine the set of rules that that case manager needs to follow in order to determine someone eligible for the youth program. So, yes, before we can do anything, we need to know what type of youth we are serving. I think that we have another poll question. Let's see this one. This one says, once school status is determined during the eligibility determination process, this status will follow the participant throughout the life of the case. Is this true or false? Let's find out. And this is true. Once the school status of the youth is determined, that school status remains the same throughout the youth participation in the WIOA youth program. So once you make this determination, that will follow that youth for the rest of their participation in WIOA Title I. So it is super important that we understand what youth status is. So let's recap a little bit. For the youth enrollment process, the first step is to determine what type of youth you're serving. Are you serving in-school youth or an out-of-school youth? It is important to remember that the youth category will determine the eligibility requirements needed in order to establish eligibility. And also, it is important to be very clear that that school status is what makes a difference between someone falling within the in-school youth category and someone following within the out-of-school youth category. So let's dive into what school status means. Well, school status is based on the participant status at the time of eligibility determination. So if the day that you make that eligibility determination, that youth is not connected with the school system or with any post-secondary system, then that youth is going to be considered an out-of-school youth. If a week later, after you enroll that youth right? That youth enrolled into a post-secondary training, then it doesn't not matter because you already made that determination. So that determination is based on the school status at program enrollment. Also, school status, as we explained earlier, remains the same throughout the case of that participant. Youth who are enrolled during summertime between school years are always going to be considered in school youth. Youth that are enrolled after they graduate from high school and they are already enrolled in post-secondary, they're going to be considered in-school youth. If they are already out of high school and when they come to you, they are enrolled in a post-secondary training, they're going to be considered in-school youth. However, if you're serving a youth that has graduated from high school, and at the time that you are completing this determination, that youth is not enrolled in any post-secondary system, then that youth is going to be considered an out-of-school youth. Now, after we make this determination, we can move forward into discussing the different eligibility requirements for the two categories. So let's talk about the eligibility requirements for an in-school youth. First of all, that youth needs to be enrolled in the school system, either secondary or post-secondary school system. The youth needs to be in the age range of 14 to 21, with the exception of in-school youth with disabilities that can be enrolled in school until age 22. All of the in-school youth have to be low income, and they have to have one or more barriers. Let's talk about the in-school youth barriers. An in-school youth barrier is either a youth that is basic skills deficient, a youth that is an English language learner, a youth that has been involved or is involved in the justice system, a youth that is homeless or run away, a youth that is in the foster care system or has aged out of the foster care system, a youth that is pregnant or parenting, a youth with disability, or a youth who requires additional assistance. We're going to be defining some of these barriers later on in our training. Now that we have had a basic overview of the eligibility requirements for the in-school youth, let's talk about the out-of-school youth. So, an out-of-school youth is a youth that is not attending school at program enrollment. It's not attending high school, it's not attending secondary school. Also, the age range for an out-of-school youth is age 16 to 24 at application. And that youth also has to have one or more barriers. But I think that before we move to describe the barriers, we have a poll question. The poll question is, which two OSY barriers require that the youth be low income? A, school dropout and requires additional assistance. B, requires additional assistance and is justice involved. C, requires additional assistance and is basic skills deficient. Or D, school dropout and is homeless. Let's think through this one. The correct answer is C. And we're going to explain why. If the OSY only barrier is requires additional assistance or is basic skills deficient, that youth needs to be low income as well. However, if requires additional assistance or basic skills deficient is not the only barrier because the youth has other barriers, that individual does not have to be low income. Let me explain this with a specific example. Let's think about an OSY with a disability who is basic skills deficient as well. In this instance, the OSY does not have to be low income because in addition to being basic skills deficient, that OSY has a disability. And because he has another barrier, which is the disability, that covers that youth from having to be low income. Now let's list the barriers for the out-of-school youth program. School dropout, youth within the age of compulsory school attendance but not attending, a youth who is basic skill sufficient, and as we just explained, if this is the only barrier, that youth also have to be low income, a youth who is an English language learner, a youth who is an offender or justice involved individual, a youth who is homeless or runaway, a youth in the foster care system or that has aged out of the foster care system, a youth who is pregnant or parenting, a youth with a disability, or a youth who requires additional assistance. And as explained earlier, if requires additional assistance is the only barrier that youth has, then that youth also have to be low income. Now let's take a few minutes and define some of these barriers. What's a school dropout? A school dropout is a youth that is not attending any school and who has not received a high school diploma or its equivalent. It is important to understand that a school dropout is someone that does not have that high school diploma or equivalent. Because if you have a youth that has a high school diploma or its equivalent and is enrolled in a secondary school, and that youth drop out, that won't be considered a dropout. The dropouts do not include post-secondary education dropouts. It's only dropouts from secondary education. Now let's move on to talk about within the age of compulsory school attendance but not attending. What that really means. This means that you have a youth who is within the age range required to attend school but that has not attended school for the last 3 months within the current school year. In Georgia, the compulsory school age is 6 to 16 years of age. For example, you're serving a youth that is 15 years old and hasn't attended school for the past 3 months within this school year, then that youth will qualify under this barrier because it's within that compulsory school age of 6 to 16 years old. Now let's move on to define basic skill sufficiency. And basic skills deficiency has a different definition from in-school youth and for out-of-school youth. We're going to start with the definition for in-school youth. What is an in-school youth that is basic skills deficient? It's an in-school youth that is behind, more than a year behind in their school credits, 5 or 6 Carnegie credits. Or is a youth that has a GPA of 2.0 or below, or a youth that didn't pass an end of the course assessment, could be in math, English, or language arts, or is a youth that is performing at an 8.9 grade level or below, or a youth that is English language learner. Now let's talk about the category for basic skills sufficient for an out-of-school youth. An out-of-school youth is basic skills sufficient if that out-of-school youth lacks a high school diploma or its equivalent, it's performing at an 8.9 grade level or below, or if that youth is an English language learner. It is important to point out that all of the individuals that are enrolled in WIOA Title II adult education programs are considered basic skills deficient. All of those individuals that you receive referrals from your local adult ed provider will be considered basic skills deficient. Now, let's define English language learner. And I know there's been some confusion about the definition for English language learner, so let's get that clarified. An English language learner, first and foremost, is a youth that is struggling with the English language. That youth has limited ability in speaking, writing, reading, or understanding English, and also falls within these two categories. His native language is a language other than English, or lives in a family or community where a language other than English is the dominant language. So it is important to remember that in order for someone to be considered an English language learner, that individual has to struggle with the English language. It could be that that individual speaks English good but has problems reading or writing, or it could be that that individual has problems speaking, or it could be that that individual just have problems with overall English language because English is not their first language. However, we have individuals that speaks a second language, but they have no problems with English. And in that case, right, they won't be considered English language learners. They have to have problems with the actual English language. Now let's define requires additional assistance. Requires additional assistance for a youth to fall within this category. A youth had to be first and foremost low income, and this youth has to have some sort of challenge in order to enter an educational program or employment. And that youth might have challenges in the area of education, employment, living arrangement, or medical, social, or family barriers. So this is a broad category, but that youth has to experience some sort of challenge in entering an educational program or training and employment. There's a long definition of what requires additional assistance. There's a long definition of requires additional assistance in our policy manual, and that's in state policy 3.2.6. So if you want to receive additional information, please review that policy. Now that we have completed our overview on the barriers, let's talk about barriers and self-attestation. It is important to remember that all youth barriers can be validated with self-attestation except for basic skills deficiency. When validating a barrier through self-attestation for eligibility purposes, please include a case note explaining why you use self-attestation. Also, only validate with documents those barriers that you need for eligibility purposes. All other barriers, we don't want you to report them, but you can use self-attestation to report all other barriers. We want you to try to obtain documentation for those barriers that you are using for eligibility purposes. And if for some reason you cannot get the documentation that you need, then add a note explaining what happened and why you're using self-attestation. Now let's talk about barriers and low income determination. This is important for you guys to remember and memorize. An in-school youth or out-of-school youth who is homeless by statute will be considered low income. Also, an in-school youth or out-of-school youth who is in the foster care system or has aged out of foster care system will also be considered low income. An in-school youth with disability will be always considered family of one if you are calculating the family income. And an out-of-school youth with disability is never required to be low income. You don't have to have an income determination because it is not required. Now I think it's time for a scenario. Johnny is an in-school youth seeking Title I services. He is referred to you by the Georgia Vocational Rehabilitation Agency as he is a youth with disabilities. Johnny lives with his father, mother, and two younger sisters. Johnny's father is a pilot with a commercial airline and his mother is a realtor. In order to determine his income status, the case manager should A. Consider Johnny a family of four and calculate the family income for the past 6 months. B. Skip over low income determination as Johnny is a youth with disabilities. C. Only consider Johnny's income. D. Skip over low income determination as you know Johnny's parents are above the income level. Which is the correct answer? Let's see. The correct answer is C. Only consider Johnny's income. Why? An in-school youth with disability by WIOA regulations will always be considered a family size of one, as we explained earlier. So it doesn't matter how much money or how little money his mother and father make. or the members of his family make, you will always only consider his income. Therefore, the case manager should not calculate family size or family income apart from the participant's family size of one and own income. Now, we're going to be discussing the youth low income exception and the required additional assistance limitation. Let's talk about the 5% low income exception. WIOA allows for 5% of youth participants who would typically be required to be low income to receive services without meeting the low income status. How is this calculated? This 5% is calculated utilizing the total number of in-school youth and out-of-school youth enrolled in the current program year that are required to be low income. Let's put this into a practical example. Let's say you have 100 in-school youth participants and 225 out-of-school youth participants. Only 50 out of your 225 out-of-school youth are required to be low income. You will calculate your 5% out of 150, which includes your 100 in-school youth and your 50 out-of-school youth that are required to be low income. And 5% out of 150 will be 7.5. So you could roughly serve 7 participants that are required to be low income, even though they don't meet the low income requirement. Now let's talk about the 5% requires additional assistance exception. WIOA allows for 5% of in-school youth participants to be enrolled in a given program year using requires additional assistance as the only eligibility barrier. For example, a local workforce development area has 100 in-school youth enrolled in the youth program. That means that that local area can serve 5 participants utilizing the required additional assistance barrier. Now, let's move to step 2 in the process of enrollment, which is determining eligibility. Low income status is relevant or it's required for all in-school youth and is required for some out-of-school youth. I want you to think about low income determination in 2 big categories. Low income determination has one category that is made of options that are straightforward options, easier to make that determination. And it has an option that is a more comprehensive option. So I want you to think about determining low income in these 2 categories. In the category of straightforward options and in the category of the comprehensive option. When we are determining low income, we encourage you to use the straightforward options first and then use as your last resort the more comprehensive option. So, what are my straightforward options in determining low income? So, my straightforward options in determining low income are: first, if that youth of that youth family receive public assistance, it could be public assistance through federal programs or it could be public assistance through state income-based programs. And there's other options, additional options that we're going to be covering shortly. So let's talk about the first option, which is that youth or the family receive public assistance through federal programs. And those are the 3 big categories that we are more than likely familiar with which are the SNAP, the TANF, and the SSI. The other straightforward options are if the youth is experiencing homelessness. As we explained before, by statute, a youth who is homeless is considered low income. Also, a youth who is in the foster care system or is aging out of the foster care system or has aged out of the foster care system by statute will be considered low income. Also, if the youth lives in a high poverty area, that youth will be considered low income. And here in this slide, you have the hyperlink for the training on how to determine a high poverty area. Also, the other straightforward option is if that youth received free or reduced lunch. Why are these straightforward options? Because these are easier to determine. Now, let's talk about our comprehensive option on determining low income. The comprehensive option to determine low income is by calculating the family income. And we want you to try to determine low income when you are required to determine low income using the straightforward options first. But if the youth does not fall within any of these other options, then you need to move to calculating the family income. We have received questions about maybe a low income, that maybe a youth that falls within the high poverty area, and people have asked if they have to calculate family income. If you were able to determine low income status using one of those straightforward options, you don't have to calculate family income. However, if the youth does not fall within those other options, then you need to move on to calculating family income. And calculating family income is a comprehensive option because it requires you to complete several steps, and it requires for the participant to provide you with specific information. So the first step in this process is determining family size. The second step in this process is determining what counts as income. The third step is calculating the income, and the fourth step is using our LLSIL chart to make the determination whether someone meets the low income determination or not. We understand this option is comprehensive and it has a lot of steps within these steps. Therefore, we have created a training specifically for this comprehensive option. And you can have access to this training in the hyperlink attached to this slide. And that concludes our first module for the youth program. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out.